minutes ago whenever we were talking about PHP, sort of hung up for a second. Like you got grainy there, Erik. So I don't know. I'm hoping that's not on my end.
I'll turn off my video, make it a little better. We are now live.
Okay.
All right. So this is episode number 51 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today we have on the panel myself, Erik Isaksen. Woohoo! Justin Ribeiro.
Hello.
And our guest today is web design astronaut and atomic splitter, Brad Frost. How are you today, Brad?
Please bear with us as we have technical difficulties.
Keep holding and holding. Keep waiting and waiting. All right, I'll stop. I'll spare you all my voice. All right, let's try and get Brad here. Sorry, everybody. Okay.
Hey guys. Man, I don't know what the hell that's. Yeah. We literally just switched internet providers, and I am concerned that I don't actually.
Yeah, why don't you close out some stuff on there and you know, lower the bandwidth, I guess, that you're using. You can turn off the video if that's all right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like I'm getting like 4 down right now, which is not good. And I'm wondering if I could go hunt to something's going on here. I'm wondering if I should go like hunt for a Ethernet cable and just like hardwire myself in real quick.
Sure. If you want to do that, just
yeah,
we'll be here.
Let me. I'm gonna. Sorry about this, guys. Let me. I'm just gonna go. I think I know where my longer Ethernet cable is, and then that hopefully, fingers crossed, will sort of make this a little more reliable, so we don't get cut off in the middle of the podcast.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. I'll be right back.
I wish I had elevator music to play for everyone.
Dun, 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 dun. I've heard that song 34 times.
I should just call up my cable provider. Just put it on the speaker here.
Is there a marketplace online for elevator music? That's what I'm questioning right now. I feel like
sure there is.
There probably needs to be that thing.
Elevatormusic.com.
I'm going to lazy web that later, and it's just going to pop up overnight.
If nobody has it, let's grab it. All right, sorry everyone, just bear with us while we're having technical issues resolved. We will have a couple of episodes that are not going to be on Hangouts, and so it'll be available on the YouTube. It won't be available on YouTube, but it'll be available everywhere else. Those will probably be Skype recordings. So if you listen to the YouTube channel, you're on there, and there's an episode missing, you could always get it on Stitcher or iTunes or on the web if you need. We have Sarah Swayden, I think. If I pronounced her name right, probably not. But she's awesome. She's really good with SVG and a lot of other things in CSS and HTML, JavaScript. So she'll be joining us August, the end of August. And also we have somebody from the Go team coming on soon. So that'll be exciting. Both of those are going to be in the evening, at least in the evening for Eastern time, 10 p.m. So Eastern Standard Time. If people are interested.
They're going to be great shows.
I hope so. I hope we don't have any of this stuff. But once we get Brad on, it'll be a great show. This happened with one episode recently, but I don't think it's happened very often lately. The one that I wasn't on with when Danny was running it, the same thing happened.
It happens to me every other week, it seems like, where something goes technically wrong somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Hey guys,
Awesomeness.
you still back with me? Oh, that makes a difference.
Oh yeah.
All right, I'm now at 85 down rather than 3 down. So
Oh, yeah.
there's something. Yeah, I think we literally just got this set up, so I think that it's all just like a matter of trying to, I guess, configure our routers and stuff in order to, like, I don't know, do something. So, okay, that is much, much better. It's now, yeah.
All right.
85 down, 85 up. Okay, all right, good.
So let's start.
Okay, sorry about
we'll
that,
restart
guys.
the episode.
No worries.
How's that?
Sounds great.
So, this is episode number 51 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today on our panel, we have Justin Ribeiro.
Hello, hello.
Myself, Erik Isaksen. And our guest today is web designer, web developer, and web astronaut, Mr. Brad Frost.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been doing lately? The topic for today, for those who haven't seen, is atomic design, which is something that Brad is very passionate about.
Yeah. So, I'm a web designer, consultant, writer, I guess, based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And, so I've been working on this thing that I'm calling atomic design for a little while now. It's basically, an extension of sort of good modular design and development principles that have been put in place, but it's sort of codified in this methodology that I've sort of been working with over the last couple of years.
Very cool. So, what is atomic design, and how did it come about?
Yeah, so atomic design is a methodology, design methodology for crafting an effective interface design system. So it's for UIs, and it's basically it came about because I really love all of this sort of modular thinking that the community has been talking about for a long while, and even things like object-oriented principles and stuff like that predate the web by a long shot. But as I started getting into it, and certainly I started seeing more of these style guides released into the wild, I'm like, these things are fantastic. But at the end of the day, I was always a little frustrated with them just because they sort of, I think got the right general idea, right? Modular design, modular development, thinking of things as components rather than as pages, which is fantastic. But every time I see these style guides sort of released out into the wild, they just sort of look like this sort of spray of modules. It's just like this sort of like loosely organized collection of components, right? Oh, here's your accordions, here's your drop downs, here's your tabs, here's your whatever, and that's great. But at the same time, I sort of I sort of found myself going, well, is there a way to sort of do this in a more deliberate way so that we could sort of thoughtfully not just create these modules, but also sort of create a bridge between sort of the modules we're creating, but also the final UIs that we're creating as well. So that's what atomic design is sort of aiming to do. Is it has these 5 sort of discrete stages in atomic design to sort of help us craft more effective UI design systems.
Now, one of the things that struck me as interesting was when I was looking through atomic design, I happened upon the post that you had done on your blog, and a lot of people just look at it as this is just for design in the UX terminology, graphic design, and when you look at it, it's really not. And so Justin and I do a lot of web component development, and this is really interesting to us because the tendency for developers is to create something like, if you have a carousel, you're going to create a carousel that has many moving parts, right? You're not going to build out the parts separately, but you might use some of those parts in other things. You would just recreate them. So what does atomic design solve those problems for development? And if not, what problems does it solve for web developers?
Yeah. So I mean, this very much works with development. Like if you're developing a UI, so you're developing a carousel or you're developing any number of components, like this is what it's all about. I mean, atomic design is for user interfaces, like so that involves, yes, the design considerations, the UX considerations, the visual considerations, but also the development considerations as well. So I guess we'll come back to the carousel example, but I'll just sort of walk through the 5 stages just to sort of give a little bit of context and sort of how this actually helps developers craft things in a more deliberate way. So sort of stage 1 is atoms, right? And sort of borrowing from chemistry, right? In the natural world, right? We have these atomic elements, right? Hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, whatever, and they all have their own unique properties. They're the basic building block of all matter, and that's sort of a beautiful thing, right? Like the richness of our universe is all gets boiled down to this finite set of atomic elements. And we on the web have this as well, right? We have this finite set of elements that we use to create all of our websites, all of our web apps, all of our intranets, all of our massive, e-commerce platforms or enterprise software, whatever. It's like it all boils down to the same finite set of stuff, which is awesome. And those atoms in the natural world sort of join together to form these sort of simple molecules, right? So hydrogen and oxygen form together, to join together to form a water molecule, which now takes on its own properties as this sort of relatively simple cluster of atoms working together as a unit. So with respect to our interfaces, we have something like a label, for an input, and we have the input itself, and we have a button. And all of those 3 atoms, right, those 3 elements sort of are their own unique, discrete sort of things, these atomic elements. But whenever they combine together, right, all of a sudden now that label is defining that input. All of a sudden now, whenever you click the button, it's submitting that form, right? Maybe it's like a search form or something like that. So now you have this really nice, relatively simple component, right, that's built for reuse, that adheres to the sort of single responsibility principle that's been, a good computer science best practice for forever. It's like encouraging these small modular functional bits, right? And then what I do at the third stage of atomic design is what I call organisms. So in the natural world, right, these molecules, these relatively simple molecules, combine together even further to ultimately create sort of more complex organisms, right? So what that means for interfaces is, now we have these sort of molecules, and those get sort of stitched together to form these more complex components, something like a carousel, right? So a carousel is composed of carousel panels, right? So the actual content of the carousel, let's say it's an image in a headline in a call to action, right? So that's its own sort of discrete, simple chunk. So that carousel panel would be its own molecule, right? But then you also have the controls for the carousel, right? The previous and the next arrows, and maybe some thumbnails, right? Some sort of navigation that allows you to sort of, go to the next slide in that carousel. So organisms are these sort of relatively complex components, and that's sort of, I think, a differentiation that I haven't seen done before, I guess. Sort of coming back to sort of the birth of this is it's like, how do we sort of deliberately construct our interfaces in such a way that allows us to create these sort of simple reusable components, but also recognize that those components get put inside of even bigger components, which then get put into the context of a layout, right, into an actual web page. Right, so that's sort of the basic gist of the sort of components, the component stages of atomic design. So back to your question about how this is helpful for developers. What we're trying to do is recognize that, yeah, maybe those three tiny, teeny little circular dots that indicate how many panels are in a carousel, well, maybe that's actually a pattern that's going to be used elsewhere, right? Maybe you have a couple different carousel patterns or some sort of, sort of paginated system that those little dots would be used, right, and sort of built for reuse. So that molecule itself is a reusable component, but then you're putting that into the context of a carousel, which is itself its own unique component that's built for reuse. It's just a more complex component.
Right. And one of the things too, like with development at least, and I don't know if this is true for designing, but at least for me it is that I tend to build something larger. Like I would build the carousel, and then inside, once I've created these things, I'd be like, well, wow, this little piece here, I could probably make it its own thing. So I'll pull that out and make it its own component. Reverse engineering these things. Like, oh, I'll share this with something else down the road.
Yeah.
I want to be consistent with these things. But sometimes for a large team, that can be difficult to work that way, to pull those things out and be, responsible about that, because then it's easy. Once I build this larger thing, I can go out and keep it there, and I can get more done. I can ship, get more done, and I don't have to worry about keeping the campfire clean in that sense.
Sure.
So
sure.
how do you deal with that? Because I know you work on large scale projects.
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, and I think that you bring up a really important point where it's not necessarily, it's like, oh, you start with atoms, you start with buttons and labels, and you style those and develop those in isolation, and then sort of eventually put them together, and then eventually put them into the context of a page, and cross your fingers and hope that it all jives and works well together. Like, you need that actual context, like that whether it's like, hey, you're responsible for building out the dashboard. Okay, well, you need to use that context to actually get your job done. But with atomic design, so I sort of defined like the first three stages, which are atoms, molecules, and organisms. And the last two stages sort of address that context, right? Which are templates and pages. So you have a carousel, and then of course, where does a carousel live? Usually on a home page, right? So you have a home page template that you sort of put that carousel, you drop that in there, and now all of a sudden it's in the context of something that looks like a web page. And you have a header, you have a footer, you have the rest of the homepage content, and you're able to sort of see that carousel in action. And so that's what the template level sort of defines the underlying content structure for that home page. And then the actual page stage, which is the most concrete stage, that is where you actually drop in real representative content into that carousel, into that home page to see it actually working. So for example, let's say, well, e-commerce sites love carousels. So you might have here's one instance of the homepage template that shows here's our summer sale, right? We just launched the 4th of July special, and we're dropping in this big hero imagery. We have a certain headline, we have a certain call to action. There's 2 other panels in the carousel, but then we also might want another instance of that homepage template, right? Something that shows, oh, here's what the Christmas marketing looks like, and now there's 6 panels in the carousel, and now all of a sudden, we're dropping in different lengths of headlines, we're dropping in different excerpts, different calls to action and stuff. And what this does is allows us to simultaneously create systems of reusable components, but also simultaneously test those with real actual content living inside them. And if things break, like let's say you drop in the marketing messaging for the Christmas carousel, and all of a sudden now that headline wraps onto 5 lines and blocks out the navigation or something, then that's a problem. You need to go back through and fix that at the component level. So what atomic design allows us to do is to simultaneously create our final work, right? Create our work in context of you're responsible for building out the homepage or the dashboard or whatever the thing is that you're actually trying to do. But like you mentioned, also leaving behind those reusable patterns, like sort of having this mental state of like, oh yeah, like we're not just creating the homepage, we're creating we're also in creating the homepage, we're creating the component pieces that make up that homepage, and we're trying to encourage reuse. We're trying to encourage consistency and cohesion across the entire user experience. And whenever you're working with a team of developers, like that becomes so incredibly critical, right? Because you might have different pieces, different developers building out different sections of the same UI, the same user experience, and you need to sort of have that shared language so that if somebody that's working on another part of the site needs to reuse that sort of dotted pagination pattern, right? They can first look to see if it exists in your pattern library, and if it doesn't, then they can go through and sort of go ahead and construct that. But you basically have everybody working using the same component pieces. You have everybody sort of being exposed to this sort of modular way of designing and building a user interface, and that helps keep things lean, that helps encourage reuse, that helps get everybody thinking about the bigger picture, not necessarily their own little slice of the pie.
And that's a great example that you said too, where you picked e-commerce. I said, so e-commerce is if you've ever worked in that industry, there's a lot of this, especially around the holidays, where just these one-off pages. We have this sale, get it done in 2 days.
Yeah.
And so what happens is, this is an extreme example, but if you don't have that pattern library, as you explained, or a style guide of some type that's kept up to date and is knowledgeable, like developers can go to this thing, look at it, understand it, and you've taught new developers where they need to go. What happens if you don't do that is that developers are going to just be in their silos and be like, well, I have to get this done. I'm going to create this. Let me look through the code. Whatever looks like the best practice and the normal styles we do, that's what I'm going to use. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm not going to worry about helping other people because I have to do this one piece.
Yes.
So I think you bring up a very key point that you need to set that expectation right at the start that you're going to use this pattern library. This is what you need to go to first. Because developers will just ask, and then you end up with 5 different patterns that serve the same purpose.
Right, and it just becomes one big unmaintainable rat's nest, right? And especially whenever you get people going, oh, well, yeah, we'll just actually use Bootstrap because boom, like here's an existing component, here's a pattern library, and we'll just skin it or whatever, and I could get that done in 2 days. But and that's the big thing that I talk with all of my clients and all the consulting I do. It's like by setting up this design system, by setting up this UI toolkit that's custom tailored to your needs as an organization, you spend that time, yes, up front, sort of establishing that pattern library. But once you have that, it becomes so much quicker to iterate on things, so much quicker to roll out new one-off pages or whatever, because you're reusing the puzzle pieces you've established earlier rather than having to reinvent the wheel every time you need to add a new feature to your product, or every time you need to add a new sort of one-off marketing page or something like that. So yeah, that's the goal. It's like, and we've talked, we run a podcast about style guides, myself along with Anna Debenham, where we interview people who have created and maintained these style guides. And one episode that sticks out with respect to this is we interviewed Federico Holgado from MailChimp, and he said that they use their 4 primary screens of their app, of their web app, to establish their pattern library. And then they were able to, whenever they got to those sort of secondary and tertiary pages, it was like butter, just because they had already established a lot of the key components that make up their interface. So whenever they got to those secondary, tertiary pages, they were just reusing the patterns that they've established elsewhere. And he was saying that they got them done in like 10%, while the first screens were like 100% effort, this was like 90% gains on sort of just by sort of dropping in. Oh, it's like, oh, we need a table here. Oh, we need these tabs here. Oh, we need this list here. And it's like, boom, you're done. And it looks great. It's responsive. It's mobile first. It's all that stuff. You've already tackled the thorny parts of the problems elsewhere. You just get to leverage those now, and those are huge gains for development teams and for companies. Absolutely.
Yeah, I've used Anna's style guide before. I love it. Can you please put a link to the podcast in the show notes?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I'd love to listen to it, and I know others would. I'm finding more great podcasts as the more I do this, the people do.
Yeah. Anna and I, we got together, and because we'd have all these great conversations with people who have established pattern libraries that are using them and stuff, and it's sort of fascinating for us, and so we're like, we should really talk to these people who have successfully implemented these things, because like most things, it's not really a technical issue. It's not really a matter of like, oh, can developers create a pattern library? Of course they can, right? It has everything to do with cultural, organizational, sort of like all of that stuff that goes into like, how do you sell these things? How do you actually, get people on board? How do you keep them useful? How do you keep them up to date? How do you keep them maintainable? So it was a fantastic learning experience for us to talk to these people who have actually made this stuff happen. So absolutely, I'll share a link. It's styleguides.io is the site, but we'll definitely put it in the show notes.
I mean,
Nice.
speaking to that, I mean, if you're a developer on a team that doesn't have a style guide, I mean, how do you bring this forward? I mean, style guides can be a very daunting task when you don't have buy-in, right? I mean, you're sort of this person on an island who has this idea to try to, streamline things, because we've seen the gains, right? There are obvious gains to having a defined style guide that everyone follows. But if you're that one person, like what are some of the main points you would hit to tell, to sort of bring this conversation forward up to a client or within your existing company?
Sure, sure. I mean, if you're, and it depends on the audience. Whenever you're talking about like sort of C-level people or management or whatever, the basic things that I'll say, with the clients that I work with and stuff is like, do you like saving time and money? Yes or no? It's like, and that's a pretty easy answer to say, and then just say, okay, well, by establishing this set of reusable sort of puzzle pieces, you basically can leverage those things and get things out the door faster. You could focus on bigger problems, on other things instead of that. And so from a business standpoint, I think it's actually a really easy sell. From a development standpoint, sometimes you definitely get into some really weird personal preferences around coding styles and stuff. I was just at a place that was like the guy. We were looking through their code base, and they had all uppercase classes. They had some BEM stuff going on. They had some camel case stuff going on. They had just every kind of syntax under the sun, and we were having a conversation about it. One of the developers was like, I hate dashes, like with a burning passion, and it's like, and the other developers in the room were like, and these are colleagues. I'm just in as a consultant, as somebody running a responsive design workshop, and it's like this is the first time they've actually had conversations about how they write their code at their organization, and it's like well, we need to sort of have a conversation about like, let's talk about dashes, or let's talk about camel case, or let's talk about all that stuff. So these sort of code style guides become really, really important for everyone to sort of get on the same page. But sort of taking a step back into sort of patterns as far as like UI components go, it's one of those things where I think everyone, whenever you talk to design teams, you talk to development teams, it's like, ask any designer, say, do you want to have 15 different button styles? Yes or no? Or do you want to have like, a handful of patterns that you can sort of use and stuff like that, right? So consistency, cohesion are like great design principles. Consistency is a great development principle as well. So again, I think that there's like a lot to promote, I guess, as far as consistency and all that goes with design and development teams that sort of help get them on board with like, yeah, maybe it's a good idea for us to all be talking together and all be sort of building the same toolkit rather than us sort of each doing our own thing and going rogue and then having to like, sort of refactor everything a year from now, or it just becomes some big unmaintainable blob.
Yeah, and that's corporate culture is a little different, like in the sense that you have developers, that we all want the same things, I think, and I think at the product level or services level, the business, I guess, wants the same things, but I think the harder thing to sell is not, we should do this, but how much time do we take away from features and bugs that need to be fixed now in order to set this in place? That's a really tricky conversation to have.
Yeah, and how I usually respond to that is listen, in order to make the whole, in order to make the final product, you have to create the pieces. We're doing this anyway. This is just like a natural part of like how we actually go about designing and developing user interfaces. What we're doing now, it's a bit of a misconception that like by sort of also establishing a pattern library in conjunction with the final product, it's all of a sudden like double the scope of work. That's far from it. we're just, what we're doing is we're just taking these patterns that we're already establishing, we're already building. Again, like even if you're like a junior level designer or developer and know what a class is, and a class is, meant for reuse and stuff like that, you're used to that.
CSS classes, just
Yeah,
to clarify.
CSS. Yes, I'm sorry, CSS classes, right? It's here's something that's made for reuse, right? You have a product tile and you're repeating that a bunch of times, right? So you're establishing a pattern. Whether or not you articulate that, whether or not you like put that aside and just say like, hey, look, here it is. It exists in a pattern library. That doesn't take all that much time, and that's sort of back to why I think atomic design is important, is because it sort of bakes in this notion of establishing a pattern library into the actual process of building the final work itself, right? Whenever I build a final interface, I just happen to leave behind all the component pieces with it, and that doesn't take me any extra time. In fact, it ends up saving me a bunch of time because I'm able to like visually go through and go, oh look, yeah, I already have these patterns, so I could just apply those here. So the it is a bit tricky to sort of articulate this and get people on board, but it's just it's about sort of saying, I promise you it's not going to take a whole lot of time and effort. It requires some mental thought. It requires some sort of deliberate thinking about like, oh yeah, like we just established a new pattern, so I need to take an extra 5 seconds to just like make sure that that's articulated. But then you could go back to actually working on the final product. So again, and that is something that in working this way for the last 2 years, by sort of baking in the design system into the actual construction of the final work, it's just sort of it doesn't become it's no longer a conversation. It's no longer like how much is this going to cost? It's like, well, this is just how we create the final website now. And
Yeah.
by the way, you get this really great reusable design system along with it. So win.
And one of the things too is that, I get a lot of developers tell me, so for layout and for our system, we want to use Bootstrap or we want to use, Material. And, people are really stuck on this idea of let's just throw something in that's turnkey, so we can do, more meaningful work, and not worry about these things. How do you feel about that in regards to atomic design? What are the pros and cons of doing that versus the pros and cons of atomic design?
Well, so to sort of take a step back, like atomic design isn't really an alternative to Bootstrap. Like, I mean, you could technically use Bootstrap and sort of in atomic design together. I mean, like if you wanted to. The thing is, these things are so popular, Bootstrap and Foundation by Zurb and stuff, they're tremendously popular just because it's like, look, here's an established toolkit, here's a UI toolkit that we can just take and we can stitch all the things together and boom, yeah, we could focus on those like higher level tasks or whatever, and that's really fantastic. But what ends up happening, my sort of main beefs with them is that they are, something like Bootstrap is a singular solution, right? It gives you the answers. It's like, here's what your buttons look like. Here's how your drop downs operate. Here's, how this stuff works. And whenever you have half the internet using this tool, this singular tool, you end up with a lot of sameness, right? And if, like, the example I like to give is like, if Nike, Adidas, Reebok, Puma were to all redesign their sites using Bootstrap, right, they would look substantially similar, and that's sort of not what they're going for, right? They're going to, they need to differentiate themselves, and these things give you a lot, but they might not go all the way, like they don't give you everything you need, and you end up having to write custom stuff yourself. But on the flip side of that coin, right, sometimes they go too far, and then your end users have to end up downloading all of this extra sort of CSS and JavaScript sort of bloat that you're not even making use of in your code base and stuff. And also, but just even back to the conversations about syntax and all that stuff. Like, I know that Bootstrap has like class equals jumbotron. Is that something that you and your team like want to use? Like, is that
So semantic.
right? Well, I mean, in class names aren't technically semantic, but it's one of those things where, again, whenever you work in a team environment, it's like, is everybody cool with this? Is this how we want to write our code? Is this how we want to name things? Is this what makes sense? I've managed teams in South America and Europe and stuff. It's like, does that even translate? So these are all like important considerations. And again, conceptually, I think they're great. There's these UI toolkits that allow you to get things out the door quicker. But at the end of the day, and like, I think that where I stand with it, it's like, if you need to get something out the door like yesterday, or you're just trying to validate an idea, or just try to get a prototype out the door, it's like, that's great. You don't have to do too much work to make that happen. But if you're like living with something, or you're growing with something, or you work at an organization where you actually like have the control, and you're planning on sitting with this for a while, like, I do think it's worth your while to establish your own custom design system, right? Something that makes sense, that is truly catered for your organization, for your needs, not just like a generic toolkit that's sort of a one-size-fits-all solution.
I mean, to your point too, with Bootstrap, they don't tell you why they do these things, right? There's no like why does this ARIA role exist on this element when I copy pasted it? There's no, you have to know that as a web developer.
Sure.
And I think a lot of people who come into it and they just want to use those solutions tend to not. There are people who do, but tend to not know that right away. I'm just saying as a generalization. So.
Oh, sure, but and that's actually I think a beauty of things like Bootstrap, but also even things like HTML5 boilerplate or whatever. It's like I just give me the best practice. Like I don't want to know.
Mm-hmm.
I just want it to work, and I think that that's beautiful. And even sort of talking about the evolution of the web with web components and stuff. It's like I do just want to copy and paste or include that carousel and know that it's going to be accessible, know that it's going to be performant, know that it's going to work with keyboard controls, know that it's going to work on touch. It's like the less I have to do to make use of a component, like the better off you'll be. But again, like I do think I truly believe that taking the time to craft your own UI design system, something that you can live with and grow with and learn from and evolve over time, right? Like, let's say you drop in these components and then you run some A/B tests and find that the carousel actually doesn't perform, but this other pattern does, and sort of articulating that back in the pattern library and stuff, and sort of updating your design system to reflect what becomes a best practice. That's sort of what we're talking about, not necessarily just like blindly using someone else's UI toolkit and just hoping that they solved all those problems.
Right. Also, like, if you have, how do you keep it like for style guides and things? There's always that issue of how do you keep it up to date? How do you make sure that the code that I'm using is reflected in the documentation that we have for this pattern library?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of the real hard thing with these pattern libraries and stuff, just because it is so easy whenever they're treated as these separate projects, right? They're treated as these auxiliary things. It's like, oh, here's our website, and then off to the side somewhere is the documentation for that, is our pattern library. And then we're just going to keep updating the website, but then it's like, oh, it's a pain to go back through and update the pattern library, and then all of a sudden it becomes obsolete, it dies on the vine, it just sort of fades off into the sunset and dies a silent death. And that's sort of unfortunate, and I'd say that, that's again what sort of atomic design and the tool that I work on with Dave Olson, Pattern Lab, actually tries to sort of get get closer to that, what I call the holy grail, right? Having your pattern library and your production environment in sync, right? Working in tandem together. And this sort of comes back to what we were discussing earlier, where it's not about like creating the component pieces and sort of maintaining them separately and then sort of, you know, using them in the production environment and just like copying and pasting some code and then that gets changed over time. It's what we're doing with Pattern Lab is basically trying to, you know, Pattern Lab is basically just nested includes, right? Where like the molecules are included in the organisms, which are included in the templates. And so, you know, if you make a change at the molecular level, right? If you make a change to a pattern somewhere, it magically gets propagated out to anywhere that that pattern is included, right? And so what that allows us to do is make sure that that final work actually is a reflection of what's in the pattern library. Taking that a step further, one of the episodes that we recorded for the Style Guides podcast was with Ian Feather of The Lonely Planet, and they established a design system which is absolutely phenomenal. They call it Rizzo. And basically what they did is they sort of created their sort of a pattern, their pattern library, I guess, in isolation, sort of. And then they wrote an API for that pattern library. And their production environment essentially eats that API. They just sort of suck in components from the pattern library. What that allows them to do is, again, like if they make a change to a pattern in the pattern library, automatically, well, obviously, you know, I'm sure they have safeguards in place, dev environments, sandboxes, or whatever, but you make a change to a pattern, and then automatically those patterns get reflected and get updated in the production environment. So what it does is it flips the entire thing on its head, and this is something that my mind has sort of been blown much in the same way that it took me to like start thinking mobile first, right? Instead of the desktop first and then you sort of squish everything down or squash it all down for mobile, it's like we flip that around and start with the mobile side of things and sort of enhance up from there. And that took a long time to sort of rewire my brain to get my head around that. Similarly, with all this talk about pattern libraries and stuff like this, it's not really the big shift for me is that it's not that we are primarily responsible for creating the website or the final web experience, and then, oh, by the way, off to the side is the pattern library that's going to die on the vine or whatever. What we're doing is we're fundamentally shifting this around where the website itself isn't the primary thing I'm creating. The primary thing I'm creating is the design system, and the final web experience is one instance of that, right? It's one, you know, it is a reflection of that design system, right? And so that for me has been just like a huge fundamental shift in how I go about my work, right? And that's, again, the harder things, especially whenever you're working with a team or whenever you're working, you know, with a bunch of different people and other stakeholders and stuff that just want to see that final work. That's a big mental shift where it's like, well, hang on, it's not just as easy as going in and changing the type size and adding a little timestamp to, you know, to this particular page, right? What we're doing is whenever we make these changes is we're updating a pattern, and then that's going to be reflected in the final work. So for me, again, this has just been like a huge shift of like sort of the system first, and then the final web app or website or whatever it is you're making is one instantiation of that design system, which is huge. I mean, it's huge. It changes everything.
When you take that approach, do you allow the design system to be influenced by new specifications that are available on the web? I mean, you have things like Scope CSS or Service Worker. Like, how do the things that are basically new to the web inform sort of the design perspective?
Yeah. I mean, like that's exactly it. And you know, very often the adjective that comes before design system is living design system, right? So this idea that the web is always changing and that the design system needs to reflect that is absolutely critical to its long-term success. And I'd say that like maybe the best example of what you're alluding to is the eventual growth, hopefully, and maturity of web components. So by establishing a pattern library today using your divs and spans and whatever other sort of things that the markup that we're using today, as these technologies mature, we could sort of take a look at our existing design system and go, okay, well now we could actually go back through and maybe refactor these things to sort of make use of web components and sort of drop out the the sort of old school way of doing a tabbed interface or whatever, and sort of swap in like a functional sort of web component version of those tabs. And so that's what sort of establishing this hub for all of your sort of UI. It gives you this ability to sort of visualize and to be able to see it all sort of laid bare to you, so that you could say, okay, and back to the carousel example, right? Like before touch was a thing, right? Before JavaScript touch events were a thing, you might have a carousel that has some previous and next arrows. And it's like, okay, well now touch is a thing, JavaScript touch events exist. So now we could take that component and actually sort of, add a little bit of code to make this thing sort of swipeable, right? So by establishing this system, it gives you this sort of future-friendly foundation that you could live with and grow with and expound upon and expand as more technology becomes available to us.
Yeah, I think one of the challenging things for me with these designs has been utilizing scoped objects. So, for instance, CSS, by its nature, was created to be very global. But now we have the shadow DOM, and we have things like CSS variables, which are CSS, I guess, properties. And those cascade, but they're scoped. So the variables you can have on like a selector, and then it's only going to be within that tree. So I've been experimenting with this. Firefox has support for the variables, but I've been experimenting with Polymer and some web component stuff with this. So it's interesting to me. Can you talk a little bit about how you might fit something like CSS variables and even Sass or some preprocessor into this?
Yeah, well, so first thing I'll say is that atomic design is specific to creating user interfaces. I've had a bunch of people send me GitHub repos that are like, check out my atomic design CSS like framework, and I'm like, no, that's sort of not what this is about. Like, I usually encourage people to follow things like Jonathan Snook's BEM or Nicole Sullivan's OOCSS or BEM or like Smack's BEM OOCSS, all that. Do that stuff for CSS or whatever. But what you're talking about is sort of like something that seems to be a trend in recent days, right? Which is like, oh, CSS by its the C in CSS is cascading, right? It's like this global thing, and you define something globally, and any element that sort of contains that will sort of inherit those properties. And a lot of people are going like, this goes against everything that all this other great like modular thinking that's happening in HTML and JavaScript and all that stuff. So we're getting like weird articles like, do we need CSS anymore and stuff. I don't know. And like the way I see it is that sometimes you have things that need to be scoped. Carousel, again, is a great example where it's like you have the JavaScript for that component, the CSS for that component, the markup for that component. It's all pretty encapsulated. It's like, everything that goes into that component is pretty cut and dry. But then you have other things, and I can't fully get behind like just CSS needs to be scoped just to a component. I think that the cascade is still really helpful. I think that's a
well, most of the
personal
polyfills
opinion.
do that. Like if you look at Myth.io and I forgot. I think Polymer has its own built-in, but they all have it scoped to the root. Because in order to polyfill it, you need to make it global.
Right.
Which is kind of weird.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I don't know.
like you put it on the root. So like when you do this, one of the things we have for web components is the gold standard repository, and that's basically a wiki. And you can go through this list of things that a good component should do, right? And one of the great things in there is, it should control its own API and be its own thing. It shouldn't rely on external dependencies. Like when you plug a video element into your website, it's gonna work, no matter what, where it is, what context.
Yes.
So something like that would require scoping in that case, because you don't want outside things to influence it.
Sure. Yeah, and that makes sense. And I think again, like for a lot of like component-based stuff, you have these nice little encapsulated components, but like I do get a little worried about being overly verbose. It's like font family, for example. It's like you want to set that once globally, and just like sort of have all the components sort of like eat that. You don't want to have to like, let's say we update our typeface and it's like, oh, you need to comb through every instance of that and stuff. I'm actually in the process right now of going through the very first website that I ever built, like professionally.
Yeah, I saw that.
For my uncle's chiropractic site, and it's funny because you could tell I was just learning about class names and specificity and all that stuff, and I'm like going like ID content H2. And it's like I don't have H2s actually anywhere else. It's all in the content section. So I'm like, okay, well that should just like be a global thing. And what I ended up doing is just sort of as I'm going back through and refactoring this stuff, I'm just trying to cut down on all that like sort of unnecessarily verbose stuff. And I guess that how that affects like modularity and how that affects like how self-contained something is, it's a balancing act, maybe. I don't know. Like I guess I haven't thought enough about it, but it's like I still see like the global nature of CSS as being really helpful, but at the same time I see that those sort of encapsulated components as being really helpful too. And so it's brave new world, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean it is a problem, and I totally agree with you. I think one of the things that can help that though is the CSS variables. So when you create a component, you define sort of, okay, well, these are the things that can be changed. So similar to something like a placeholder, right? You have : webkit to affect that placeholder with CSS, right?
That's if you look at miserable syntax. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. But if you drill into that and you look at the shadow root of that, you can see where that part is, right? And so in web components, this is a way for the outside to influence the inside without really doing, a lot of damage. So it is not really like the stuff that they had, like piercing with CSS, like with deep and shadow. We knew it was wrong, and we put it in anyway. But we needed to test that. I think that's the main reason.
Yeah.
Because important, is nobody wants to use important anymore,
right.
and these are just other hammers. So we needed to test that out.
Yeah, and I definitely think that there's a lot to be gained for exploring these things. I guess like the main thing that I sort of keep coming back to is it's like, well, here's like the basic cascade like works. It just it's been there like since the beginning. It's just a characteristic of the language, and it's always fascinating to me, like as new technology progresses, where it's like, we sort of do a lot of backflips, or we have a tendency to do a lot. Hi there.
Hey, welcome back.
Hey, I'm back. I just got a white screen of death. But yeah, I don't know what that was, but yeah, like I always get really fascinated whenever there's just an overwhelming amount of complexity that gets, or an overwhelming amount of effort that gets exerted simply to do something that oftentimes like comes out of the box for free. That being said, I mean, like I'm not really involved in like in web standards and like that whole thing. I am but a lowly web designer just trying to do my job. But like I always get fascinated whenever like for example, it's like like submitting a form. It's like, people like write all these crazy like JavaScript bindings and stuff, and it's like, well, you could just write some markup that and then hit the submit thing, and then it'll take you to a URL. It's just, you know what I mean? Like,
I think I've built sites like that.
right. But you know what I mean? Like, it's one of those things where like when exploring new technologies, there's obviously some needs to explore these things. There's some obvious needs for for things to progress. I guess like in my own mind, I also like to recognize the fact that like some of this stuff just it actually works currently and works pretty well, and want to simultaneously progress but also sort of preserve what's already working.
No, I think it's a great approach. And you bring up a good point too, like functionality and behavior are really integral to design. And so in translation for code, that would be probably JavaScript, most likely for the web. How do you see JavaScript fitting into this? Because it seems to be, we have Angular and React and all these other things, and I know we're not experts in these things, but how do you see JavaScript fitting in?
To what?
Behaviors. So if you were defining, let's say, one concept that Polymer has is these shared behaviors. So if you want certain accessibility that's common among several elements, you can get that for free by including in your element sort of a mix-in.
Oh, interesting.
That'll add to the API.
Oh, that's
now
interesting.
You have key bindings that you can utilize in that.
Yeah.
So functionality and behavior, basically.
Sure. Yeah. So it's like they're sort of almost like invisible components in their own right. It's like you sort of drop in this like invisible component, and that gives you some extra superpowers. That's really cool. I like that. And again, I'd say that hearing you say that it is a sign of like the maturity of JavaScript, that it's like come a long way. It's now really like object oriented, and things are trying to be sort of as reusable as possible and stuff. So again, like I see it as being totally complementary when it comes to actual sort of how that influences like our actual visible sort of UI, tabs, for example. It's like, all right, well, we have tab functionality, and that obviously relies on some JavaScript in order to make those tabs functional.
And the states and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that all of that stuff, can and probably should be like bundled together with the actual components and stuff, and that's where again like web components as the future is pretty exciting. Looking at things like Polymer and Angular's what are they called, directives or whatever their components are called, look like healthy bridges to that future that hopefully is really modular and encapsulated and all that. Yeah, and that's quite a bit different, I would say, again, than style. I do think that there is like it is tightly coupled, right? The actual markup and then the behavior of that is typically really tightly coupled together.
Awesome. I know we're running up against time. Is there anything that we didn't discuss about atomic design? I know you're writing a book about it. I'm pretty sure we mentioned, maybe we didn't.
I can't remember.
But you are writing a book. I have purchased that book.
Thank you.
Is available for pre-order now. It's not quite finished.
Yeah. So I'm writing the whole thing out in the open. I sort of wanted to avoid the situation of like a year from now descending from a mountain and going, behold, I've written a book. It is now available for you to read. So in a way, sort of writing this thing in the open is keeping me honest, is keeping me accountable, and hopefully, just getting those ideas out to the world sooner than later. So it's been pretty fun, yeah. So you could support the project by basically pre-ordering what will eventually be the final ebook of that, and I'm sort of like using those pre-order sales to make a print version of the book, and so people that support the project early on will get a sizable discount on the print version and stuff like that. So it's been a pretty fun way to do the project. It's a bit like doing a Kickstarter without Kickstarter. It's like hey, I'm gonna do this thing, and you could support it, you could back it, you'll get the final ebook at the end of the day, and a discount on the print book whenever that comes. So it's been pretty fun. But yeah, so I just actually finished up sort of writing about the atomic design methodology, sort of what we were talking about earlier. So if you want to learn more about that, like that's all up at atomicdesign.bradfrost.com.
Very cool. And we have links to a lot of that, as well as ports for if you're interested in the implementation stuff for development for Pattern Lab, the PHP original, and also Node version that we found.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of them out there, and there's lots of style guides as well. So with that, can you tell us your Twitter handle, how people can find you, ask questions?
Sure. Yeah. So I blog on my site at bradfrost.com, and I'm on Twitter at Brad_Frost. There's a non-underscored version floating around out there. That was probably me years ago. I don't know. The underscore has stuck though. So, but yeah, happy to answer any questions, and people shoot me emails all the time or whatever, or tweets, and I'm happy to receive them. So.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed your dog also has a Twitter handle, Ziggy.
Yeah, Ziggy. My Instagram feed is pretty much all my dog.
Great. Well, if people want to definitely help out with Pattern Lab or Atomic Design, it is on GitHub, a lot of it, and like Brad said, definitely go and take a look at atomicdesign.bradfrost.com. Well, thanks for coming, Brad.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.
All right, take care.
Bye.